Lori has covered with you. And then she will have some time for questions and answers before her final reflections. I'll put her agenda up before we turn the mic over to her. Then we will allow a 30 minutes kind of after class for open forum discussion. And Sister, you're warmly invited to attend that, but recognize you may not be able to. So next slide. As is my practice, I typically start with a quote. And this one I've lifted from off of the page of Sister's book, The Voice of the Peacock. This is Flannery. The writer's gaze has to extend beyond the surface until it touches that realm of mystery, which is the concern of prophets. That is a paragraph for Sister's chapter 1 of her book, The Voice of the Peacock. Next slide, Gretchen. So just a quick look back, and at the bottom, so these are the classes we've covered, but the Osher staff was kind enough to let us extend both for our 5th session, which was last week on O'Connor and race relations, and then this very special session today with Sister. So this is 6 out of what originally started as a 4-part series. So thanks, Osher, for your support in this. Next slide, Gretchen. So just a very quick flashback to last week, thanks to the Emory team who joined us introducing their upcoming 2023 exhibit with Flannery O'Connor and Benny Andrews there on campus at Emory in Atlanta. And 2 of those team members are friends of Osher, Amy Elsenauer, number 1, and then Dr. Nagyalti Warren, who gave one of our presentations last week on O'Connor and Walker. Also, special thanks to David Weiner, teaching Flannery O'Connor and Toni Morrison, who pinch hit on a very short notice and gave a very fine presentation. So just a very special and large thank you to the Osher staff for your support on this added session. Next slide, please. So this may look familiar to you. This is just a listing of some of the book-length literary criticism books that I've encountered. And the second one of these series was written by Sister Kathleen Feeley in 1972. And we are just delighted to have her here today. So next slide, please. So while the agenda is up for what she's going to cover, let me just pause. And she asked me to commit to only a very brief introduction, which is hard to do with her 2-page CV. But Sister is President Emerita of Notre Dame of Maryland University, where she actually started as a student, where she has her BA from when it was operating under a different name, the College of Notre Dame of Maryland. She has her MA in English from Villanova, her PhD in English from Rutgers, and also was a student at Claremont University Institute studying change, which is interesting. She was a professor of English at this College of Notre Dame in Maryland. She was president of this college from 1971 until 1992. She had a number of Fulbright teaching awards in India and in China, has taught in Australia, in Africa. She presently is quarantined like many of us, working on a book, but also working as a dissertation proposal writing editor in the School of Education at her university there. She's also been a visiting lecturer at other colleges, St. John's in Santa Fe, Georgia State College in Atlanta, Longwood College, Wheaton College, Notre Dame College in Japan. Her book I've mentioned, she has another book she's published on the history of Baltimore, the School Sisters. She's written articles in America Magazine and a number of awards that I'm not going to call out. I think 7 at my latest count, but Sister, it is really a delight to have you with us today. And so let me turn the microphone over to you and take us with you back to meeting Flannery and her mother. Thank you.
Now, may I begin?
You may begin, sorry.
That's okay. I'm very happy to talk with you today. It's one of my favorite things to do because I think Flannery O'Connor is an extraordinary person. That quote, mystery, the mystery of life, the mystery of grace. So I'm going to tell you first about her visit to Notre Dame, what was then the College of Notre Dame of Maryland, a woman's college in Baltimore, Maryland. And I have to say that she wasn't very known when she came to us in October of 1963, less than a year before her death. She wasn't well known at all. She had written by that time and published two novels, Wise Blood and The Violet Buried Away, and one book of short stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find. So that was her output at that point, at her death. One collection of short stories and two novels. So she wasn't well known, but she was well known in our English department. We had a marvelous chair, Sister Mara Eichner. You'll hear her words again. She's the one who kind of uncovered Flannery for us. And she decided to invite her to come and open a series of lectures we have every year. This was the series beginning in October 1963. It was perfect because we usually invited women, and she was a perfect candidate to really thrill our students. So letters were exchanged back and forth, and there was a little problem with the travel arrangements. At this point, Flannery, who's kind of a small woman, she had crutches that hit her around the arm, steel crutches, not like under the arm, but they just gripped her arms. And she had trouble negotiating, navigating them. So she wrote a letter saying that she'd love to come, but she had to get a plane that was nonstop. She said, I can't take a plane that would necessitate my changing in Washington because I walk on crutches, and getting on and off once is all I can manage. So finally they got a plane from Roanoke, Virginia. She was, the day before, she was giving a lecture at Hollins College. So she came to us from Hollins, and someone went to the airport to meet her. And it wasn't a good schedule for her because she had a lot of free time. And it was kind of dear. She said, in this excess time, I'd be glad to answer student questions or read papers or do whatever is useful. But I thought that was so dear. She wanted to earn her stipend, And I might add right here, she didn't want to be dependent. Now, she lived with her mother, but she paid her own way. She paid rent to her mother. I mean, she really needed to make money. And I think it's so interesting because she could have found so many easier ways. But she loved writing. And of course, this was her talent. This was her skill. This was her ability to create characters that we don't see every day of the week. She looked at what she was seeing around her. She was definitely somebody who was paying attention. So she did come, went to the airport, picked her up. And because she was early, she wanted to rest, so she had time. We have a beautiful guest suite right above our library. So the librarian kind of was taking care of her, making sure she got, bringing things in and doing. But she kept saying, no, I'm fine. I don't need anything. So we went over to the auditorium, about 10 minutes before 4 o'clock was her lecture. And I wasn't at the college. I keep saying university, it's now a university. I wasn't at the college at that time. I was teaching in the prep school, pretty close. So I was one of the first ones in the auditorium, wanting to get a good seat. But I didn't have to worry because really there were about 250 people, many of whom were students for which this lecture was a necessity. They had to be there. And there were about 250 students in an auditorium that seated 900. So I didn't have to worry about getting a seat. One thing I noticed right away was that most lecturers come in the back and walk down the aisle and there's about 6 steps up to the stage. She didn't appear. The president and entourage walked down and went on the stage, and then she came out from the wings. Now, I found out later that she didn't want to try to navigate 6 steps with 2 crutches in front of an audience. So she went down the floor below. They showed her there was another way to get on the stage, but the steps were 3 times as many. There were about 18 steps up the back that she would not have to be in the sight of others. And I thought that was kind of beautiful too. She always made very little of her illness. Somebody asked her if her illness was a problem with her writing career, and she said, "I write with my head and not with my feet." She didn't bear fools gladly. So when she came out on the stage to begin her lecture, I was all attention. She talked about this wonderful thing called the Catholic writer in the Protestant South. She wanted people to understand that she was a very, very deep, sincere Catholic. But there's only one of her short stories that has a Catholic setting. Her setting was always, if it had any religious connotation at all, it was Protestant, because the South was Protestant. She looked around and watched others and could see how they demonstrated their faith. And that's what she actually gave her audience. So this talk on the Catholic writer in the Protestant South, I recognized later when Mystery and Manners was published, because that was a collection of her talks and essays. So almost everything that I heard, I read later in this book that they put out after her death. Many posthumous books, only 3 at the time of her death. And she said, the mystery of grace, comes through nature. It's part of nature, but it transcends nature. And I think if you've read the stories, you can see that. There's a moment of grace in every story, which can be accepted or rejected. And you know that key story of hers, about the grandmother and the misfit. She looks up at that misfit, readying herself for the shot, and she said, "Why, you're one of my children." She sees for the first time that she's not an isolated person, but she is part of the universe, part of the universal humanity, and so is he. So they are the things that if you don't understand, you say, some people say, "Oh, that story's terrible, that man kills people," and so forth. Well, it's not terrible, it's absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful family story, a vacation that goes wrong. But the woman who is the center of it, the grandmother, all through has been a very self-centered woman. Everything, it's her way or no way. But at the very end, the sky lights, her eyes light, and she takes the grace that's offered her. It's an extraordinary writer who could do that. But she says, I have to make everything real that you can see, so that what you can't see becomes real also. And that's her key to her success. The thing not many people can do, to write stories the way she writes them. So that's that lecture that she gave. She tried to explain that. She talked about grace and stories. And she said, the center of the meaning of the story will be Christ. The center of its destruction will be the devil. And you have to think about that. Then she said something that really enlightened me. She talked about the Hebrew genius for making the absolute concrete that has condition the Southerners' way of looking at things. And this is the illustration that she gave. Our response to life is different if we have been taught only a definition of faith than if we have trembled with Abraham as he held his knife over Isaac. And you can see that's faith, ready to do it. So she's trying to do a very difficult thing to get readers who need large and startling figures in order to communicate deep truths. So I remember when I was listening to her that I just wanted to hold on to every word. That's why I was so glad I saw it later in print, because I couldn't hold on to every word. But she had the ability to write lectures well. She was written very well. But as one of the students said in the newspaper, this campus newspaper the next day, Miss O'Connor was very interesting, but she really didn't talk in an interesting way. I could have cried, but that's a student newspaper, so she wasn't, I don't know how to say it. She certainly got good applause at the end, but I wonder if she got through to the students whom she should have gotten through to. So I kept thinking about it, and she went then to a small dinner with some guests, and then she went back to her little apartment. And the next day, she came to the Sister Moore's creative writing class, and she wanted to take questions. Well, I have a complete tape of the questions and answers, and I really think some of them are good, and I thought I'd like to share them with you. How do you know what to write about? You usually start with something you saw, an incident, and you work on it. You don't really know which way it's going, but you try to leave yourself open to the way it will go. Sometimes you know it isn't going the right way. Sometimes you have to put the story aside, and 3 years later, you know how to do it. But you have to be willing to do the wrong things so that you can learn how to do the right things. Did you ask somebody to read your work? Oh, yes. I always try it out on someone to get a reaction. But I work on my stories for a long time before I am remotely satisfied. I don't send them out for publication until I am completely satisfied with them. Do you include symbolism in your story deliberately? You can tell these are college questions. Not the way you sprinkle in salt and pepper. You write. And then when you are reading, you realize that if you emphasize certain things, details, you will strengthen the unity of your story and you will foreshadow its conclusion. Then the reader at the end can say to himself, oh, I should have known from the beginning. Do you intend a moral purpose in your stories? No, not in the sense that I put moral in. But I am concerned with the necessity of belief. However, first, I want my stories to be enjoyed. I love that one because I taught Flannery O'Connor in Japan, and the Japanese people had no idea the biblical background of those stories. And I was so afraid I just would be a complete, we have a college, Notre Dame sisters have a college in Japan, and I went over there on their anniversary and gave this talk, and I was so worried that they wouldn't get it. But they did get it, but not the way I thought they would. They got the humor, they got the combination of the grotesque and the humorous. They got the style, but a lot of them did not understand the basic theology of the stories. but they liked them. They liked Flannery O'Connor in spite of that. I was amazed and delighted. Um, why do people in the South write the way they do? I hate these questions, but I think they're really funny. The South has a tradition of storytelling, for one thing. For another, the South probably has more social tensions right now than the North, and it is aware of them. The Northern writer often writes how he feels about something. The Southern writer thinks about its social implications. I think you all know what she's talking about. Should a writer confine himself to things that he knows about for his stories? Or should he use his imagination? He should probably use his imagination on the things he knows about. But he needn't be afraid of something he hasn't experienced. One way to learn whether you can swim on a kitchen table is to try it. Now, the students in that creative writing class were always talking about, Sister Mara was saying, write about what you know, and they wanted to write about what they didn't know. So the one that the sister told me later, the person who asked that question had asked her the same question and gotten the same answer, for which she was grateful. Not composed as cleverly, but the same answer. Write about what you know. Use your imagination on what you know. When do you work? In the morning. I make myself do it for 3 hours. Do you always have something to say? Almost never. But I sit at the typewriter just the same. When I first began, I could think of so many reasons to get up and go away that I put a bucket of water under the typewriter, took my shoes and socks off, and put my feet in the bucket. When I wanted to get away from the typewriter, it took me so long to get my feet out and dry that I finally stayed at the typewriter. How about that? But what do you do when you have no inspiration? I read over what I wrote yesterday. Then I retype it, sometimes changing it, but at least always retyping it. That gets me started. When you call a character Joan, do you know, in part at least, what that character is like? We don't have any Joans in the South. We have special names. But yes, I do know what my characters are like. How do you get titles for your novels or short stories? They come. They come sometimes when I'm working on the story. When I was working on my last novel, I happened to be reading the Eastern Fathers, and one of them had a favorite line from Scripture. Heaven is taken by violence, and the violent bear it away. That was exactly what my novel was about, and that was my title. Do you know how a novel or book is going to end before you write it? Yes and no. Sometimes what happens as the story goes along is different from what I thought would happen. I try to go along with what happens. Does reading help writing? Yes, very much. A young writer ought to read the best, enjoy it, and then look to see how it was done. I started with those who had beliefs similar to my own. Mauriac, Bernanos, Green, and sometimes Wall. Then I began on the Russians. I still read them. Do you read much contemporary material? No, I am not interested in it. I still have so much to learn from the best of the past. Is there anything you don't read? I don't read people whose style is so overpowering that it will make me lose my own. For example, I don't read Faulkner anymore. I read all of him, and I think he is fine, but he is too powerful for me. I can't read him without being influenced by him. But I can read all the Conrad and all the James I want to read, and it helps me. Do you make a special use of colors in your story? Every good writer makes the use of color. You have to make your reader come to the story through his eyes and ears. Let him see and hear. Bright colors help. How much do you write in a year? I hardly even get through 2 stories a year. I write slowly. And I could add to that she writes again and again and again the same story, trying to get it perfect. She said once that she spends 3 hours in the morning writing and the rest of the day recuperating from it. She goes out on the front porch, big front porch, and watches the peacocks and the swans and the birds and the horses. That ability to know what you need and to get it. Flannery left the afternoon of that session with the students and was driven to Georgetown. And when she got home, I thought this was kind of beautiful. She wrote letters back thanking people. She said, for instance, she wrote to the sister who was the librarian who was bringing her things. Thank you so much for all you did for me while I was at Notre Dame. I'm hardly accustomed to having my breakfast brought in and my bed turned down, but I do appreciate it highly. About that. And I'll remember with much satisfaction your beautiful library. And then she thanked the academic dean and said, I would like to thank the young lady who met me at the plane, but I did not catch her name. All I got was Jo. Her name was Josephine. So I would be very much obliged if you would tell her for me that I did appreciate her kindness. So when she left the college after that overnight stay, I think everybody who met her in any part of the campus was very impressed with her, but very quietly impressed. She's not a noisy person. She's a quiet person, but great wisdom comes from her lips. Now, this is like part 1. I felt that I really got to know her, not really personally, that comes later, but really got to see what her character and her stance and her speech was. It was very helpful to me. Now, is there anybody who'd like to ask anything about that? Because if you do, it's now, and then I'm going to move to my visits to her home. Any questions? It's hard to question because
I don't have any questions in the chat right now.
Excuse me?
I don't have any questions in the chat right now.
Okay.
Somebody has something they want to ask.
And maybe I should move on. Okay.
Maybe we should accumulate some for the next break.
But okay, fine. After that was finished, I studied Flannery O'Connor's 3 works. And the very next year, Everything That Rises Must Converge posthumously was published. So that's her second collection of short stories. So I had 4 books to work on. But I didn't have anything else. I was really glad because usually when you write a dissertation, you have to do a review of literature and talk about everybody else's work. There was only 1 book written before mine, so I didn't have to talk very much about it. So I just studied the works. I felt like Flannery O'Connor because I would sit at my desk in front of a typewriter. I didn't have a computer. This is way back. And read and say to myself, I'm not going to get up until I can understand why this happened, or why she did this, or why this, because I really believe that everything, she worked so so steadily and carefully. Every single thing meant something. It was all part of the whole. But no, nothing was there extraneously. She has no extraneous violence, no extraneous anything. So I really wanted to try to figure out for myself what's behind it. So I worked very, very hard on that. And meanwhile, Sister Maura uh, wrote to her, sent her a poem for her birthday. She only had one birthday after we saw her, and then she died in August. March 25th is her birthday. And she got a beautiful letter back, and Flannery said, I've never had anybody write a poem for me. So she was very pleased. And also, after she died, Sister Maura sent sympathy, a mass and sympathy cards to her mother, and they kept up a little bit of a dialogue in correspondence. So then, after I had spent 3 years really working on this, I still had the feeling that I didn't really know Flannery O'Connor. I knew her work, and I felt I knew it very well. But I really wanted to go to her home. So I took a big chance, and I wrote to her mother and asked if I could come to visit. And told her I was writing a book on her daughter's work, and I would so much like to see to be in her milieu, because I had never been to Georgia at that point. And I couldn't believe the blessing. Mrs. O'Connor responded very graciously. She invited me to come from September 23 to 27 and stay with her, if I wouldn't mind being treated like home folk. She offered to meet me at the bus station. So I flew into Atlanta and then took a bus to Milledgeville. Now, Milledgeville was capital of Georgia during a very short period of time during the Civil War. And nobody who lives there ever forgot it, because there's nothing like Milledgeville. So Milledgeville is a little village, really. When I was riding, it was a 3-hour bus trip to Milledgeville. So I had a lot of time to look at the scenery. And it was very interesting. I saw splendor and squalor right next to each other. Beautiful mansion, and then some very, very poor houses. Dun-colored shacks with saggy porches with plastic chairs on them. But it was interesting. I noted the name of the church pastor, Dr. Bevel Jones. Recognize Bevel? And I thought of the preacher in the river. So I was met by Regina at the bus station, and she's a wiry, quick-moving woman, a small woman, but very wiry and quick. And she drove me a short distance to her city home, an imposing white house with pillars on every side and a beautiful brick wall around it, and a driveway. And we took the driveway around to the back of the house, and I went in through the kitchen. So I really was going to be home folk. The house was beautiful in antique splendor. Tall ceilings, airless rooms, a very, very typical Southern wealthy house. It didn't have a single trace of Flannery. Flannery did live there with her mother, but she had a room on the 3rd floor, and she didn't like it when people called her to come down and meet Miss So-and-so and Miss So-and-so, these little Southern visits, and visitors would come and Flannery had to come down, and she didn't like that. But I think she just put up with it, but she didn't like it. So they moved to the farmhouse, Andalusia, beautiful farmhouse willed to Flannery's mother, where she really spent most of her adult life. She left Georgia and went up to Connecticut, New York and Connecticut, but that's when lupus struck her. So she really went up perfectly healthy, went out to Iowa, earned her master's degree in creative writing, then was going to go to New York and make her name. She went to New York. She started out well. She went to Yaddo, a writer's colony, and started writing. Then the Fitzgeralds invited her to live in a little apartment at the top of their barn out in Connecticut, and she loved it there. But on her way home for Christmas, after just 1 year, she was smitten with lupus. So she went from the train to the hospital, and she never went back. So God was saying to her, I think, this is your milieu, and this is where you're going to make it. I think she had another view because she liked being in New York, and she liked being writing at the seclusion of the farm that the Fitzgeralds lived. So I didn't find anything of much interest in the city house. But every day, Mrs. O'Connor would take me out to the farmhouse because she was having siding put on the farmhouse. And she keeps an eye on everything, but she was keeping an eye on the people putting the siding there. So basically, I had every day I went out to the farmhouse, which is where I wanted to be. I received Regina, her name is Regina's permission to explore the bookcases in the 2 sitting rooms. I soon abandoned the show bookcase, which had all the ornaments in front of the books, and concentrated on the second bookcase. There I found thumbed and annotated books. And I knew I would get a glimpse of the mind of Flannery from those books. I slipped my large note cards from my purse and sat down immediately. Now, what I did, it was a strange way of research, I'll tell you. I knew I had very little time. I had a lot to do. So I would note the edition of the book, the number of pages, publication date, so I'd be sure to get the right book when I came back. Then I would turn the pages and simply copy the markings that were in it, page 67, paragraph 3, a sentence or an underlining or something, so I could see what Flannery thought of this, what was in this book. I didn't have time to think about it. I had to do it fast, just put it down, and knowing when I went home, I would get this exact book and I would turn to the right page. Most of the time I read all the books, so everything was in context, but I just needed to get her markings, where she underlined or where she put an exclamation point or where she wrote something. So I did that, furiously, if I could put it that way. I never did anything so fast because I knew my time was short. So I would work undisturbed because Mrs. O'Connor every day went into town. She picked up her mail from town and did any shopping she wanted or something. So she was really gone, which was wonderful for me. But then she would come back and she'd say, well, how about having a Coke on the porch? And I would gulp and say, that would be great, So we'd go out to the porch. And I just minded leaving the books. But it was interesting when we sat on the screened-in porch, big screened-in porch in the farmhouse in rocking chairs. I saw what Flannery saw every day, because that's what she did. She came out to the porch when she had written her 3 hours. And it was beautiful. The farm was lovely. The peacocks were walking around. They had ducks that would come up from the pond and walk by. They had horses on a far field. They had a lake, an artificial lake for watering. The animals could water at the lake. And beautiful, beautiful southern trees. It was really a beautiful sight. And I could just imagine her sitting there tired from the morning's work, as I was tired from the note-taking, and just looking at it. It's just a beautiful view. So it just gave me a feeling of how that must have encouraged her and strengthened her resolve to keep going on her crutches. So some of the things I could see her stories. I saw her stories all around me. Mrs. O'Connor that day, sitting out on the porch, told me about the new Holiday Inn across the street, across the road from the entrance to the farm. She told me she was delighted with it, as she believes in progress. Even though she had a slight problem when her geese crossed the road and took a swim in the motel pool, she is quite friendly with the proprietors. She feels that her beautiful horses grazing on the hillside provide good scenery for the motel guests. Of course, I thought right away of Mary Fortune Pitt's indignation at her grandfather for selling the land in front of their house for a gas station. I mean, all these things. You could see how Flannery took what she saw before her and just used her imagination on it. And I thought of a view of the woods where the three little boys ride Mrs. Cope's horses at a circle of fire, because you could see the horses over on the hill. On the third day that I was there, Mrs. O'Connor offered to show me Flannery's room. I entered a large room with 3 tall windows, one with an air conditioner. In front of the closed-up fireplace was a gas heater, raised from the floor on cinder blocks, because Flannery had difficulty bending down to adjust the gauges. Next to the bed was a large chiffonier. Up against the back of it was Flannery's writing desk. Now, think of the back of an old piece of furniture. That's what she's facing, the back of the piece of furniture. So she's concentrating, but she's limiting her vision to everything around her. She had an old wooden desk with a low center for a typewriter and higher sides. And she had a little green file cabinet next to her bed and an easy chair. And in the bookcases of her room was something. She had a complete set of the Encyclopedia of Catholicism, which I have never seen any place in my life except in a library. She had a complete set. She had books on the prophets. She had books that were you could see all of her interests in the books right in her bedroom. That's what she really used, I think. She had a small bedside table with 2 copies of the Bible, one Catholic edition and another the King James edition, and a psalter and a missal. She was just surrounding herself with the tools that she needed. On the last day of my visit, I opened a drawer in the bookcase and found some of Flannery's work as a child. I was thrilled to see such early evidence of her talent for cartooning and her satiric wit. Now, you know, she drew cartoons all the way up through high school and college for the newspaper and the yearbook. And she kind of took that cartooning talent that was within her and put it in words from then on. She didn't do any more cartoons, she just wrote. But you can see the comparison between the two. One cartoon that I think has gone with the wind, I loved it. It was a little girl walking on the street and a woman and a man. And out of the little girl's mouth came this, it had age 9 written on it, came these words. No, out of the mother's mouth came these words: "Hold up your head, Mary Flannery." Child, I was reading where somebody died of holding up their head. I mean, funny. Another cartoon showed 3 faces with superscriptions. "Ladies and gents, meet the 3 Mr. Nosies." Under the appropriate faces were the titles Mr. Long Nose, Mr. Sharp Nose, Mr. Snut Nose. A small booklet of 2 typed pages was entitled My Relatives, spelled wrong. She was not a good speller, ever. Relitives, My Relatives. And that followed by short satiric descriptions of uncles and cousins and everybody in her family. On a piece of primary paper, in a child's hand the following poem, The Bird That Wanted a Telephone. There was a little bird that sat on a limb. She was not short, but very slim. And she said to herself when she was alone, I wish I had a telephone. Something, and there's more to it, but so I put everything carefully back in the drawer and said to myself, this will probably never be seen again. And I don't think it has. So that, I better move, we're almost finished, okay. Mrs. O'Connor took me back to the train station. I thanked her and thanked her. I went home. I worked for a year on what I had done. At the end of that year, I was very concerned that I missed some things, that I couldn't decipher this note that I put. And I wanted to go back. If I just had a little more time, I could do more. So I went back. I asked again if I could come. And this time, Mrs. O'Connor was living in the farmhouse. So I wasn't in the city house at all. And it was a wonderful time. It was 5 days, and I stayed with her and really had a chance to re-look at things and straighten out things that I'd gotten mixed up in my notes and whatnot. And again, she was very cordial, but she was so like the women in Flannery's stories that sometimes I just had to want to give you a specific example of that. Find it fast. She seemed to be a model for lots of the self-assured women in Flannery's fiction. One day, when I commented on how nice she looked in a certain suit, she told me she had ordered it from Hong Kong and it was very expensive. Then she added, but at least you don't meet yourself coming and going. If you read the stories, you know. When she hired the displaced person to work on the farm, I found out that she had hired a displaced person to work on our farm, which you see, you know, Flannery made a story of it, but she did have a displaced person there. And she often spoke the kind of things that you read in the stories. It takes all kinds to make a world, you know. I mean, those cliches were very much part of her vocabulary, and you see them sprinkled all through. So I found that that was a marvelous way of making sure I was correct in what I had assumed. And years later, when Flannery's letters were published, I saw that I interpreted her marks correctly. I could see a corroboration of what she was thinking as she was writing, as she was reading and annotating her books. So Voice of the Peacock, Flannery O'Connor, Voice of the Peacock was the result of all this. It was published first by Rutgers University and then bought by Fordham University, who published it in paperback. And it was one of the delights of my life to have this opportunity to see a real artist, almost see her in my eyes practically, and think of the talents that God has given many of us. So I'm very happy to have talked to you all. You probably don't have any time for stories now because Craig asked me to give a little time at the end, so I think I better stop. But you're wonderful listeners. I can watch your faces and see that you're taking everything in. It's kind of beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful just to hear you talk and all the details of your experience. It seems like you really captured so much from those two experiences. I'm just curious. I put a question in chat, and anybody else who has a question, please put it in the chat, and I will read it. I was wondering if you got the sense that Regina had read Flannery's stories and perhaps saw herself in them.
No, Regina did not read Flannery's stories. She just didn't. I mean, I know that. So she wouldn't, and I'm glad because I think she would have seen herself in them and maybe not liked it. But that was Flannery's work, and she was so a neighbor down there told me, Regina wanted Flannery to be independent, which I understand that. And if she had been crocheting scarves and selling them, that would have been fine. But she was writing and selling it, and that was fine. She just wasn't a literary person. So one time she said to Flannery, Flannery mentioned some writer, and she was so funny. She never heard that name before. Somebody very, very worldwide known. So she just wasn't a literary person.
Somebody said here, this is a question again. Supposedly Flannery had a better relationship with her father than her mother. Did you get any sense from Regina as to what their mother-daughter relationship was like?
Well, her father was like Flannery was like her father. He was a writer. He was a thinker. He was a very deep man. Mrs. O'Connor was probably a wonderful wife and housewife, and she kind of took over and took care of things and could manage a farm. A woman down there managing a farm by herself. She was a very competent woman, but she was very different from Flannery. And they separated jobs. Mrs. O'Connor cooked, and Flannery O'Connor did the dishes. That's the way it always was. One cooked, one did the dishes. I mean, they kind of each had their own sphere and they stayed in it. So I think Flannery appreciated her mother because she never could have gotten along as well as she did with her sickness if somebody hadn't been kind of taking care of her. But she really was a lot like her father. But he died when she was 16. So.
This is a comment. I guess this is from Craig. I guess there's a question here. Bruce Gentry says many of Flannery's stories come from incidents Regina described to her after her day out and about. Do you have any comments on that hypothesis? That these were stories from her mother or incidents that her mother reported to her rather than things she had seen herself?
Okay. I don't know. I know things like one of the townspersons said, there was a certain, the Hanson, there's a house, a very nice restaurant most of the town went to. And this woman said, I go to that restaurant, but I never get anywhere near Flannery O'Connor because I don't want to put her in one of my stories. I don't want to get in one of her stories. So I think the town a little bit didn't quite understand her either. So that's the only thing I can remember. But she didn't do a lot of out and aboutness. However, another good picture, she often used to get in the car with her mother and go to the post office when her mother picked up the mail. And she would sit outside because usually there was more doings inside. And she said the whole local universe passed by. I love that. The whole local universe passed by. So that's where she saw the people that she wrote about. But she didn't do much traveling around. She really didn't because of her illness. And I could see her mother bringing home stories and things to her that happened during the day, and she would tuck them up here and use them later.
Well, I have another question. Do you have any stories that you consider your favorites?
Her
Flannery
favorite is what I've read was The Artificial Nigger. I also love that story. That's, when they both look at this bent over statue, chipped, and something between that granduncle and the nephew melts the antagonism that they have built up. And it's so subtle. They just look at it and something goes through. I love that story because I read many pages in her, when I was down there about how she tried to write this. And she moved the center of the story from the grandfather in the middle to the child at the end. You usually keep the same focus. I think it's a masterful story. And when the child, 12 years old, this boy, sees that beautiful Black woman, and he just feels something he's never felt before. I mean, you can't do that unless you're a genius, I think. So if you haven't read The Artificial Nigger, that is one wonderful story. I like it the best too.
Craig wanted to know if you got to go to Mass with Regina.
I didn't hear what you said.
Craig asked if you had got to go to Mass with Regina.
Yes, we sat in the back pew. Last pew. It's funny. It's a small church. Very few Catholics down there, very few. But Flannery and her mother used to go. So Regina took me to the church, yes. And I sat in the last pew. And I guess it was a Sunday Mass because the priest was singing. And when we left, she said, he's pleasing himself. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think I've gotten through the questions. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask?
Well, that's okay.
Right.
Kind of hard to ask questions simply because it's a narrative, and
Well, there's so many things you've told us already. I think we just probably all have a lot of little questions.
Yeah.
I just was curious about the fact that her room, Flannery's room, was still the same
It was
as
exactly
before she died. Was that, why do you think that was? Was that her mother trying to preserve it, or just it was just an accident?
I don't know, but I'll tell you what gave me a shock when I went into the room, and her mother went away, and I had liberty to walk around and open things, which I did. On a horse, or thing that you hang your clothes on in a room, was the coat. Was her coat, evidently her spring coat, because it was
Oh
October.
my gosh.
For some reason, I put my hands in the pocket of the coat and I pulled out the envelope that had her stipend from College of Notre Dame of Maryland. I just went, oh, I could hardly believe it. I mean, nobody had touched anything.
Wow.
So I don't know why. I think maybe, I shouldn't hazard a guess. I don't know, but her room was exactly the way she walked out of it the last time. It seemed to me. But that envelope in the coat pocket, and it was, this was now years after.
Oh my gosh.
It was her. It had our logo on it. It had her return address on it. I could tell it was an envelope that one would put a stipend in, and put it in an envelope. So.
There is another question here. Do you think her books are different from her short stories?
Yes, I do. I think she was a short story writer. Her short stories are superb. And of course, it takes a real talent to get everything she got in a short story. As she said once, I think, a short story is short in only one dimension, length. Depth, height, it's all there. So I definitely think her stories are better. In fact, I think By's Blood, her first novel, was not her best. I think she got better and better and better and better as she wrote. I really do. I liked the violin very much, but I didn't particularly like By's Blood. I thought it was, I think the editor said too angular. It sounded like a good word to me. But I think she's a superb short story writer. Superb. She just takes a small section, small space, and crafts it so that everything is there. The depth, the height, the length, the width, everything is there. I think she's a marvelous short story.
When you met her, did you get the sense that she was in extremely poor health and that she maybe didn't have a long time to live?
Well, how can I answer that? I think that's true, but I don't think she displayed it at all. She made this very least she possibly could of her affliction of her. She just didn't talk about it. She managed to do what she needed to do. It wasn't primary in her life. Her writing was primary in her life. She said at one point, I don't know whether I'll finish this story or the story will finish me.
Wow.
She knew she had a limited time. She knew it. She saw her father. Her father died, lupus. So she knew, but she didn't advertise it.
Yeah.
So Sister, this is Craig. First of all, thank you so very, very much. For some reason, our audience is a little shy. So
we do have Susan Stewart does have her hand up.
okay.
Have you asked your question, Susan?
No, I had a couple. I just haven't been able to get my voice up here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there were two things. One was the student referred to Flannery as not having a terribly exciting oratorial style. And how did you find that, or was it consistent?
I found her. I agree with the student. You know, somebody a good speaker is, but Flannery was just standing there quietly saying what she wanted to say. And as I said, if you didn't hear it, that was your problem. So she was not an exciting speaker. She was a deep, thoughtful speaker. So
her writing was so vivacious.
Real loquacious style at all.
Right. Okay. And then the other question was, I can't remember her history, but I thought their family came from a northern city or someplace other than the South. And so did their life seem to be like a transplanted northerner would maybe be, or a reflection of the Southern culture that was theirs?
Susan, I think that information is available. It just isn't on the top of my mind right now, but she's not a transplant northerner. She is a deep Southerner, and her whole family. She called her sister, and not her name, not Mary or Joan. She called her sister.
Sister. Okay.
And their whole family, their whole background was Southern. Now, before that, I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
So other raised hands or questions? So Sister, I was about to ask if you would object to us maybe sending you some questions via email if they come up after the fact. And we will try to limit them. And then secondly, I wanted to say that there's one item on your bio I didn't bring up. So I'm just going to add it for the group. And that is you are a friend of Osher Milwaukee. We very, very much appreciate your time today. And we invite you to stick around if you care to for the next 35 minutes or thereabouts. But I had a few additional items of business I wanted to cover with the group before we officially end the Osher session at 3:30. So Gretchen, if you could just put up the couple remaining slides, I'd much, much appreciate it.
Well, I'll just sit here and watch it, Craig.
Thank you, Sister. Thank you so much.
And Craig, then I can stop recording.
Sure. Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Lori.
Sure.
So just a couple of things to draw your attention to. We mentioned